held. The second one was held at Monash University in Melbourne, and we had a previous meeting to decide who won the best spoon at the Hillsville Animal Sanctuary, which is a bloody long way from Melbourne Airport in a cab, let me tell you. It cost me more to get from the airport to the Hillsville than it did to fly to Melbourne. But at that meeting, we made a decision to appoint 2 people as life members of Australian Skeptics, because they had just completed a book which is entitled Creationism: An Australian Perspective. One of them was a maths lecturer from Queensland University, Dr. Ken Smith, and the other one was a sociologist called Dr. Martin Bridgestock from Griffith University, a fresh-faced young lad with an English accent. 19 years later, he's still got the English accent. He's not quite so young, fresh-faced, well, I suppose you could say that, but I'm delighted Martin has been using skepticism as a tool in teaching at universities, and I'm here to listen very intently to what he has to say. Give him a warm welcome.
Thank you. Now, first thing I've got to do is to try to get this set up, and usually by operating by Murphy's Law, something is going to go appallingly wrong. So let's try. Yes, things are beginning to happen. Don't worry, there's still got time to go wrong. That seems all right. And in case you can't read it, that actually says flailing in the undergrowth, not ailing in the undergrowth. Okay, my position is totally anomalous and very strange at Griffith University. I'm a senior lecturer in the School of Science. All around me are scientists. My boss is a physicist, her boss is a biologist. Next door I have chemists. I myself am a social scientist. I'm one of a small group of people who teach an area called Science, Technology and Society within the School of Science. So we're very much anomalous, and people regard us as being extremely strange. But we've been there many years, and the scientists have got resigned to us. They can't get rid of us. Over the last couple of years, and this is where the skeptics come in, I've been teaching a course called Skepticism, Science and the Paranormal. And for a number of reasons, I regard this course as a raging success. And by the time I finish my talk, I hope that you will too. At least you'll see my reasons. I'm almost certainly not going to tell you everything you want to know, so I'm going to leave a few minutes at the end so you can ask questions, and if I have missed any factual points, please feel free to ask me about them later. Okay, I started off looking at statistics like these. This is in fact a survey which was done earlier this year by Reader's Digest. They phoned up a cross-section of Australians, asked them about their various paranormal beliefs. And as you can see there, belief in an afterlife. Over 80% of women believe in the afterlife, 60% of men. Houses can be haunted, women 80-odd%, men 60-odd%. Possible to communicate with the dead, women 83%, men 70%. Can sense when someone is watching them. Women 83%, men 70%. 80% of everyone believes in psychic powers. Now, as somebody who's done some survey research, you have to take figures like this with a pinch of salt. First of all, I know from experience that slight variations in questions can produce enormous differences in the answers you get. And secondly, if you simply ask people whether they believe in something, and they give you an answer, you can't tell whether that answer is just a spur-of-the-moment answer about something they've never thought of before, or whether, in fact, they're talking about something that they've organised their whole lives around. So survey research like this has very much got its limits. But these kind of results are the kind of thing you do get. There's been a whole range of surveys done now over very many years. And the main points, I think, that come out of it are these. First of all, a very high proportion of the general population believes in some aspect of the paranormal. Second, women tend to believe more than men, although the differences in this survey are bigger than most of the others I've seen. And thirdly, if you look at the item at bottom right, there's a tendency for involvement and interest in the paranormal to be slowly increasing over time. Those three features come out of a great many surveys. So take them with a pinch of salt by all means, but there's quite a lot of evidence backing these up. Now it's terribly tempting, and I've heard speakers sliding into this over this weekend, to think that the answer to this is education, preferably science education. The problem is it doesn't really work that way. Eric Good, who's an American sociologist, has done studies of the effects of education on paranormal beliefs. And what he's found is that, yeah, some paranormal beliefs do decline with advancing education. Creation science does. Broadly speaking, creation scientists tend to be less educated than the rest of the population. On the other hand, some other beliefs are completely unaffected by advancing education. such as ESP, UFOs, and so on. So education of any kind, science education in particular, doesn't seem to be an answer. Here's a survey I did last year of first-year science students. I surveyed about 300 of them, about 240 odd replied. 57% of them reported holding at least one paranormal belief. Now what I did was I gave them a list of 16 paranormal beliefs, such as ESP, telepathy, the lost continent of Atlantis, creation science, and so on. And I asked them to indicate on a 5-point scale how far they believed in it. The strongest category was believed, then there was tend to believe, don't know, tend not to believe, do not believe. And 57% of them ticked at least one belief. That is the strongest category. The average was about 2 beliefs per person. Now for me this is quite disconcerting, is that I go into a lecture theatre with 200 first-year students, and something like 114 of them have got at least one fairly firm paranormal belief. There is a contingent of ESP believers, telepathy believers, a smaller contingent of creationists, and so on. Really quite disconcerting. When you amalgamate the belief and the tend to believe categories, then the most common belief was ESP, and 57% of them believed or tended to believe in ESP, 54% of them believed or tended to believe in ghosts, and 44% of them believed or tended to believe in telepathy. So these are quite large levels of belief. They're not quite as spectacularly high as for the general population, but this is a science first year. Nearly all these students were doing bachelor's degrees in science. There was a small contingent doing environmental science, another contingent doing pharmacy, but basically they were first year science students. Now, there's been research in America, and here the research becomes very sketchy, that the disciplines vary in their belief in the paranormal. You might think that science students would be the most skeptical. In fact, they're not. Science students are in the middle. The most skeptical students of all, according to the American research, are psychology students, whereas those strange people in the social sciences and humanities have very much higher beliefs than the scientists. So there are some differences, but they're not quite what you might expect. There's also some indication that academics are more skeptical than the students. There is some good news, and here's a bit of good news. Along with these 16 paranormal items, which I asked the student about their beliefs in, I also smuggled in some science items. Evolution, quantum theory, continental drift, and an item on the Big Bang theory of the universe. And broadly speaking, belief in these was much higher than belief in the paranormal. For instance, over 90% of them believed or tended to believe in continental drift, over 80% of them believed or tended to believe in evolution, and only the Big Bang theory was belief so below that it was below some of the paranormal beliefs. That's why I call this talk Flailing About in the Undergrowth. If you think of belief in the scientific theories as being like trees, they're tall and they're also fairly firm. People are quite likely to come straight out and say, yes, I believe that. Whereas with the paranormal beliefs, the levels of belief are much lower, and they're also much more tentative. They're much more likely to say, I tend to believe it. So that's why I think of paranormal beliefs as being undergrowth, being dwarfed by the scientific beliefs, being softer and less certain than the scientific beliefs, but still very much there. And because we know so little about it, because we know so little about how these beliefs fit into people's lives, we're flailing about with it. We don't really know what's going on out there with these massive beliefs that we know so little about and how they work. So that's where my analogy with the undergrowth comes from. Tentatively summarising these results, there's a high level of belief in the paranormal in the community at large. One suspects a lot of it is very casual, just glancing at horoscopes or maybe occasionally going to a clairvoyant. One doesn't know. It's not been researched very much. Among students, the levels of belief are a bit lower. They may well have been lower yet among academics. It varies according to the belief, and there's also variation among the different disciplines. We really don't know all that much about it. It was these kind of figures, though, that set me thinking, can I bring in some kind of a course which might help to counter these very high levels of belief, even among my own students, the people who are sitting there facing me in the lecture theatres? Well, I prepared about 3 years ago a sort of little list of pros and cons. And on the left-hand side here is the pros, why it might be an idea to bring in a course teaching about skepticism and the paranormal. My little area, science, technology and society, has got a problem. And the problem isn't our fault. The problem is that science generally across the Western world is finding great difficulty in attracting students. It's true in America. For example, half of America's postdoctoral researchers are not Americans. They were born abroad. They've been brought into America to do the research. Science is finding it very difficult to attract good students. Why? Well, because in the current climate, there's a great stress on vocational education, getting educated in order to get a job. And a lot of science degrees, such as physics and maths and chemistry, are hard. They're demanding. There's a very real chance of failing. And at the end of it, you've got your degree, and there's still no necessary job on the end of it. If you're prepared to work hard and do a difficult, intellectually demanding degree, why not do accountancy or law or medicine, which is vocational, which does normally have a job on the end of it. So science faculties everywhere are having trouble attracting high-quality students. And since we're within science, that means we have trouble attracting students too. So that was one reason I thought we might get more students. Our second and third year courses were suffering rather badly. We've got about 200 first years. The average we were getting in our second and third year courses was about 15 to 20 students. Some of them were beginning to sink into single figures, and this was all a bit discouraging. Secondly, I thought we might gain valuable publicity for the university. Now, if you want a textbook case of how not to publicise a university, look at Griffith University over the last 20 years. They seem to hire a new public relations consultant every couple of years. They'd bring in some awful new, very expensive campaign, and the university's ratings would continue to plummet. So I thought maybe I could get a bit of publicity for the university. I have no idea why I thought that in retrospect. Let the university worry about its own problems. Thirdly, and this is the one that I would like to accent, I could spread some good ideas. Actually introduce some sceptical ideas into university and perhaps have some effect on these high levels of belief. Were there considerations against it? Oh yes, there were. First of all, of course, anything to do with the paranormal is weird, oddball, not considered to be proper academic study. And secondly, I was a bit worried about what those in positions of power might think about this little initiative of mine. What would the Vice-Chancellor think and so on? Now, to leap ahead a little bit, I haven't had a single negative comment from any colleague. The Vice-Chancellor's been quite supportive. There's one grumpy biologist who seems to glower at me a lot more than he used to. He's never actually said anything. So I don't think he's going to say anything now. And finally, and more seriously, there's an ethical problem. What was I going to teach? How was I going to teach it? Bearing in mind that paranormal is a controversial area, bearing in mind that an awful lot of people have beliefs in the paranormal of greater or lesser strength, how would I teach it? I'm skeptical, outright, no argument about that. Well, logically, when somebody stands up in a lecture theatre and teaches something, whether it's evolution or quantum theory or continental drift, you have to assume that they believe it, or at least there's some level of truth in it. But if you try to teach your own beliefs to students, and even worse, assess them, the students absolutely hate it, and quite right too. I've heard the fury in students' voices as they talk about particular lecturers, where they know they have to tailor the answers to assessment questions to the lecturer's beliefs. They don't like it, and quite rightly, there's no reason why they should. And thirdly, as an academic in a public university, I don't regard myself as being entitled to tell people what to believe. My pay comes from the taxpayer, and to a lesser extent from student charges. I'm entitled, I think, to require the students should understand things and be able to demonstrate that they can do certain things after learning, but I don't have the right to tell them what to believe. So there were some ethical problems in there, quite complex ones too. And then, how would I teach the course? Well, here are some things that all skeptics know, I suspect. First of all, the paranormal is a huge, diverse area. It's enormous. Many of the beliefs contradict other beliefs. And it's simply not possible to do a tour of all of them. If I sort of did a lecture a week on some aspect of the paranormal, I could take up a whole year. And I still wouldn't really do anything which was really worthwhile. But secondly, and this is important, skepticism applies to all paranormal areas. If you have a paranormal claim of any kind, the skeptics can say, well, okay, here's a paranormal claim. What's the evidence for that claim? How good is that evidence? Is there the possibility of a natural explanation which would not require the paranormal? And so the skepticism and its basic approach could be at the very heart of the course, asking the tough questions about the evidence of all these different, enormously diverse areas of the paranormal. This is a slide I used in the course to show, in fact I did it in the first lecture to show a course I was not going to teach. There's a cute little bus rolling around the various paranormal topics. So Tuesday we'll do ghosts and hauntings, Thursday we'll do perpetual motion, next Tuesday we'll do channeling, and so on. I emphatically wasn't going to do it, and the little alien hitchhiker was therefore going to be rather disappointed. In my view, that's not an appropriate university course. You can find rubbishy books like that. Reader's Digest have produced one called things like Into the Unknown, which really are not worth teaching. This, by contrast, is. You put skepticism, these questions about evidence, right at the very heart of the course. And then skepticism can ask the same broad kinds of questions about any aspect of the paranormal. So you require that the students understand the basic skeptical approach. They can then choose which aspects of the paranormal they're particularly interested in, and they can apply the skeptical approach to the paranormal claims. Now, sometimes the paranormalists reply, that too would go into the overall evaluation of the paranormal claims. There would be some kind of a controversy in the argument. I gave examples of this in the course. In the first year I talked about remote viewing, which David Marks and Richard Cameron analysed very well in their book. And I also talked about creation science, which is something I've known something about for quite a few years. So I showed them how to do it, and then they were expected to apply skeptical approaches to the different aspects of the paranormal. What are these skeptical tools I'm talking about? Well, at the most abstract level, at the highest level, applying to every aspect of the paranormal, there seem to be three. One is the burden of proof. Now, I know that in the last issue of The Skeptic, Jeff and Theo Clark argued that the burden of proof could be fallacious. My view is it's not necessarily fallacious. The point is we do know some things about the universe with a fair degree of confidence. We don't know everything by a long way, but we know some things which have been established by a great deal of investigation. And therefore, if a claim runs counter to what we know, it doesn't mean the claim is necessarily wrong, but it does mean that it needs strong evidence. For example, we heard yesterday about the evidence that the Earth and universe are very old. There's a lot of evidence that the Earth and universe are very old. So if somebody comes along and says the Earth and universe are only 10,000 years old, the answer's got to be, there's got to be strong evidence that is so. Otherwise, the claim can't simply be entertained. That's the burden of proof. The burden of proof is on the claimant. Then there's Occam's razor. If you have a satisfactory natural explanation for some paranormal claim, you don't have a paranormal explanation. You don't need unnecessary explanatory entities. And thirdly, Sagan's balance, named after Carl Sagan. If you have an extraordinary claim of some kind, you need evidence which is appropriately strong to buttress that claim. If you have very weak evidence, it won't buttress a quite astonishing claim. Now, there's an article early in 2002 in the Skeptical Inquirer by a fellow called Alvaro Caso, who goes into these three in some detail and explains why they're important skeptical principles. It's an irritating article if you read it, because he's oh so very, very clever, and he's going to show you who are not quite so clever how very clever he is. But he is clever, and he does spell these out. So, although it's irritating, yeah, I use the article. It's the best explanation of these most abstract skeptical principles. Now then, of course, as you go down and talk about specific aspects of the paranormal skeptical approach to them, then you get more specific skills as well. For example, if you're going to talk about alternative medicine, you've obviously got to know about the placebo effect, and you've obviously got to know about double-blind controlled trials. If you're going to talk about UFO claims, you've got to know about the reliability of eyewitnesses. If you are going to look at creationism and its claims about it to be scientific, you've got to know about the checking of creationist references to science, and so on. So there are the most abstract skeptical concepts, which are the ones I've got up here, and then there are more specific ones which apply to some areas of the paranormal and not to others. Now, this is another slide from the course itself. When I tell the students very clearly, whatever your views on the paranormal, to think about it clearly, you have to be aware of the nature of the claims being made, the skeptical position, and the relevant evidence. Now, it is quite amazing how many students come into a course and say, oh yes, I believe in ancient astronauts, I've read all the evidence, I've read Eric von Daniken's book, or I know all about UFO abductions, I've read a book by Whitley Strieber or David M. Jacobs, and that's as far as they've got. And then when you point out there may be some skeptical evidence on this particular topic, what do skeptics say about it? Oh, I don't know. I expect you to go and find out. So this is fairly important, that first breakthrough, when they realise that maybe just reading the work of proponents of the paranormal doesn't necessarily amount to a complete survey of the evidence. And so consequently, here's another slide from the course. The course stresses a skeptical position and requires that you understand its nature and how it's applied. But your views are your own business. I stress this very clearly. I put it in writing, and I mean it. I'm not trying to tell people what to believe. I'm concerned with them getting certain intellectual skills, certain intellectual tools which they can apply if they're interested in the paranormal. But if they come out at the end of it still believing in the paranormal, that's their business, and I don't mark them down. In fact, the second year I did the course, which was earlier this year, the very best student of all, the top scoring student, believed in acupuncture. He acknowledged the burden of proof, and as far as I could tell, he met it. He produced several dozen double-blind controlled studies of the effectiveness of acupuncture. I had to give him a high mark. What else could I do? Here's another slide when I warn the students about dangers of the course. Thinking that they know all about an area because they've been interested in it for a while. This second year, a nitwit came to see me 2 or 3 weeks after the course had started and said, I want to do the course. So I said, all right, you're going to have to do a lot of extra work because you're several weeks behind. Told him where the lectures were, told him the books to get, everything like that, told him the website. He didn't do any of it. And then the very last seminar of the year he was due to give, he came along and he gave the most awful seminar I've ever heard. He didn't understand a single aspect of the course. He thought he knew a great deal about it. He knew nothing. He failed. The second warning there, the second danger, having a strong belief which makes it impossible to look at criticisms, I found was not so dangerous. People basically who came on this course were warned that they were going to look at new things, and most of them appeared to be very open-minded about it. Okay, so much for the intellectual structure of the course. They have to understand the basic skeptical approach. They have to be able to apply that approach to selected aspects of the paranormal. They have to be able to do some kind of thoughtful analysis of the evidence, but their final beliefs are their own business. That's the intellectual structure. What did I actually do? Well, the first year I taught this course, back in 2003, I had 15 lectures. That wasn't enough. I pushed it out to 20 in the second year, and that seems about right. There's a nice even pace throughout the course. That, by the way, is less than similar courses have, which also count for 10 credit points. Typically, they have about 30 lectures. But I give them a big website, I give them lots of reading, and that seems to back it up fairly well. I start off by talking about science. Now, why do I talk about science? Because both the paranormal and skepticism are at least partly defined in terms of science. So you've got to start off by telling the people something about science, because they don't get it otherwise. My approach to science is really noddy in science land. What I do is I say, what do scientists do? Well, they do two things. First of all, they collect evidence. They do experiments, they collect observations, they do analysis, they collect evidence. On the other hand, they theorize. They try to work out how the universe actually works. Now, the theories, which are current at any time, decide what evidence is collected, because mostly scientists are looking for evidence to confirm or falsify particular theories. But the evidence, which is then collected, then decides which theories stand and which theories fall. So there's a constant interaction, a constant tension between the theory and the evidence. And gradually, this increases the areas of phenomena in the universe that we understand. Once you've got a simple model like that, which isn't at all rigorous, then you can add things to it. For example, advancing technology enables scientists to collect different kinds of evidence, which in turn affects the theory. For example, radio astronomy in the second half of the last century, deep sea drilling, both transformed particular fields of science, cosmology and geology, and so on. So I give a very simple characterization of science like that, stressing theory and evidence collection. The paranormal, there's lots of definitions of the paranormal. The one I use is that it is phenomena which are contrary to scientific theory and not explicable by scientific theory. Skepticism is the responsible investigation of the paranormal using scientific methods. And then I talk a bit about the interactions between them, and then I go on to talk about things like creation science, remote viewing, and so on, so they can actually see how skepticism actually works. Then I go on to other areas which are similar to the paranormal, but not quite the same. I talk about evidence-based medicine, which is essentially trying to use the best quality of evidence that there is to decide which medical cures are appropriate for which conditions. Quite an interesting area. Holocaust denial, although it's not a paranormal theory, is very closely related to it in its intellectual structure and the way it works. And as of next year, I'm going to bring in the Apollo moon hoax claims as well, because again, it is similar to these paranormal claims, but not quite the same. Aside from the lectures, the editor of the Skeptics given permission to use articles from there, and I'm going to get hold of another copy of the CD and put that in the library. We've got links through the library to Skeptical Inquirer. There are other books, there are websites, and the students learn an enormous amount from the seminars that they give as well. So that's the mechanics of the course. What about how they pass or fail? Well, our area doesn't have any exams. We got rid of set piece exams many years ago. They get a 15% mark for the seminar. They'll give given a few weeks' notice. They prepare a talk of 15 to 20 minutes, and typically it would be a skeptical assessment of some aspect of the paranormal. Then, if they make a mess of it, or if they don't, they write it up. They write a paper of about 1,200 words, and they hand that in, and that's marked out of 15. There's a mark for attendance and participation. If they turn up to most of the seminars, they'll get most of the marks. If they make intelligent comments, they'll get even more marks. And finally, at the end, there's a take-home exam. You give them a paper, they have to do 2 questions over 2 weeks. Last semester, 2004, I gave them the option. They could either do 2 questions or they could do 3 questions, or slightly shorter. And that seemed to work quite well. And I'll probably keep that as well. There's no set-piece exam, but there's a range of different kinds of assessments. Sorry? Right, what were the results? Well, as I say, our area was running very short of numbers in its main studies. The average is about 15 to 20. The first year I did this course in 2003, I did a fair bit of publicity, put up little leaflets and things like that. Got on about a dozen radio interviews, things like that, and the numbers rose to about 25. Naturally, when I first went into the lecture theatre, I wondered what I was going to face. The number of jokes was amazing. Was I going to go in and find myself looking at sort of rows of little green men sitting there? Or was I going to find their notepads and pens floating in the air in front of them? Or would I see Nessie stretched out along the back seats? Nothing like that. They're absolutely a normal cross-section of students, which means they're everything from incredibly conservatively dressed to absolutely weirdly dressed and everything in between. Just you couldn't tell them from a normal cross-section of students at all. Except in one respect, which I'll come to in a minute. Then, with no further advertising, none at all, in the second year, 2004, of course, the number simply doubled to 50. Words got out on the student networks. This course is cool. It's good to do. And suddenly, people are starting to flow into it. I'm getting people coming up to me now as I wander around the university saying, I'm going to do your course next year. One of them proclaimed herself to be a witch, and then told me, I'm going to do your course next year. I don't know what she's going to make of the course. How can you tell them from ordinary students? Well, by their behaviour in the lecture, because I've never known anything like it before. I mean, like many lecturers, I'm a bit of a lazy slob. I've got all my notes done, and I like to go into the lecture theatre, deliver my 50-minute lecture, and trot out again. They won't let me. Forest of hands, questions all the time. They're sometimes queuing up 4 deep to ask questions about the stuff, and I'm just trying to get through my little lecture, and there they are, questioning all the time. The most lively lecture of all was one I gave on superstition. And I started off with B.F. Skinner's theory of superstition. He's got a behavioural theory of superstition, and he could actually induce something like superstitious behaviour in pigeons. This has also been done in human beings, and it appears to work. And the lecture just broke out in pandemonium. For some reason, they weren't having it. They ended up arguing with each other and arguing with me. I've never had this level of interest and involvement before. It's really quite overwhelming. Does it change viewpoints, change ideas? Yeah, it does. About the 3rd student seminar, a mature student had given a seminar, given a very good seminar on the crash saucer theory of Roswell, and he'd torn it to pieces. He'd indicated the evidence was not strong enough. He'd indicated that there were very good alternative explanations. And he said to me afterwards, he said, you don't know what you're doing to me. I'm having to rethink 50 years of belief. And at that time, I began to see that this course has a terrific impact upon the people who take it, even though I'm not imposing my beliefs on them. Nonetheless, putting these tools into their hands and into their minds does have quite an effect on some people, far more than I expected. Generally speaking, the standard of work was very high. Nobody at all failed in the first year out of the 25. Typically, you get a failure rate of, say, 10%. I didn't realise that nobody was going to fail until the actual marks had been added up at the end. And then the next bit has actually been censored. It was going to go out in a magazine story, but External Relations didn't want me to say this, but I'm going to tell you anyway. One of our administrators took me into her office and said, look at this student. And she pointed to one particular student who'd done my course. Look, she said, he's failed everything. He got sort of 1% in this subject, and 3% in that subject, and 5% in that subject. When he was an academic disaster, except in this particular course where he got 55%. Now, I knew the student. He wasn't brilliant. He would never get a degree. I don't think he could handle it. But he'd put a terrific effort into this course, and he'd passed this particular course. I wasn't supposed to say that because it implies that Griffith University doesn't take good care of its students. But anyway, I've told you about it. Overall, the standard of work was very high. There were a few failures in the second year. The nitwit I've already told you about, and another nitwit who didn't do anything. If they come to the lectures, they start to get into things, and they start to do fairly well. If they don't, then they get into trouble. One feature of the course that the students did appreciate, and they kept telling me this, was its intellectual integrity. The fact that I started off with the idea of skepticism, I spelled out what the principles of skepticism were, and then I said, apply these principles and come to your own conclusions. Now, at the same time as I was putting this course on, some of the scientists, who were also worried about their declining numbers, put on a course which they started to call Physics for Poets, which was about the big scientific ideas about the universe. That course started off with more students than mine has got. It's now fallen away very badly, because there's no integrity to it. There's simply scientists come in, talk about things that interest them, and wander off again. The course has no centre, whereas my course very definitely has. Some problems with the course. Yeah, there's quite a few. First of all, the cranks zero in on you. I got a terrific burst of publicity when I launched this course in 2003, and as a result, every crank across the country wanted to contact me. A fellow from up north in Queensland sent me a couple of CDs, which I had the word of God on them. God seemed to be a quite appalling waffler. I mean, it was page of total nonsense. Another bloke said he had several hundred hours of TV tape, which conclusively demonstrated that the paranormal was real. But he was very edgy and evasive about what organisation he belonged to. It sounded like a cult, so I pulled clear. The worst one of all was one that surfaced only a couple of months ago, when I was coming back to my office after checking some references in the library, and there was a little note on my door from a senior police constable telling me to contact her about the service of a summons. And it turned out that a person on the Gold Coast had sued me. And among other things, what she was accusing me of was training student psychics to read her mind and take control of her. But I had broken into her apartment and into her car, stole letters of patent, police photographs, original designs, and worst of all by far, I had in fact organised some of my students to pelt her with eggs from a moving car and had hit her in the right kidney. I'm a terrible person, as you'll gather from that. Believe it or not, this went to court. My university stood by me. They hired a firm of solicitors on the Gold Coast, and we trotted down there. And my solicitor explained that there was no possibility of any kind of mediation on this. And the magistrate then immediately squashed this woman like a bug and said, don't take this to court. If you take it to court, you'll probably end up with a huge bill. And she very angrily withdrew her complaint against me. The last thing I heard from a nice psychiatrist on the Gold Coast, and she's now in his care. But this kind of thing happens, and it can be quite nerve-wracking. Yes, you've got the article, did you? That's great. Wonderful. Read it then, yes. During the first year I did the course, there were allegations from students that the course was not intellectually respectable. Nobody said anything to me, but students say things to other students. And some of the ones who were doing real science were apparently quite dismissive of this course. But it wasn't in the second year. The first year that happened. In the second year there hasn't been a single whisper. Words got around. The course is cool and it's okay. Then there were silly statements by politicians. The stupidest statement of all was by a certain Brendan Nelson. That apostle of reason and moderation, Alan Jones, on the air. You can even do a degree in the paranormal, he said. Well, you can't. This is 1/24 of a degree, and it's totally optional. So I wrote a little article in the Australian spelling it all out. He hasn't apologised, he hasn't retracted, but at least he's shut up. And then, of course, you get the media asking the silliest questions. Every claim of weeping and bleeding statues and strange lights and everything else seems to come to me. I don't know anything about these things, and I don't have the time to do it anyway. Now, all of these are sort of funny. The first one, not very much, or partly funny. The rest of them are all funny. This last one isn't funny. The impact on some students could be quite devastating. I mean, look, we're skeptics. That means that we're committed to believing on the evidence. If you've got a belief, and you suddenly discover the evidence doesn't fit the belief, you know what's got to give. Your belief has got to change. That's what skepticism is about, believing on the evidence. You'd think that would be true for almost any person. It's not entirely true at all. Many people have not grown up believing that. And as a result, right at the very centre of their beliefs, right at the very centre of their lives, there may very well be unsubstantiated beliefs. And even though I don't ram skepticism down their throat, even though I don't push particular viewpoints at them, the impact on them when they're unprepared for it can be quite devastating. This is from an American academic called Frank Trocco, who runs a course in some ways similar to mine. And he says, anyone who's worked with students who hold unconventional views or who believe in seemingly useless health modalities knows how deeply these ideas are felt. It's important to realise that students who follow your suggestions, carefully reading critical books and thinking about the sceptical approach, can experience a minor existential crisis. Suddenly they will not know what to believe, and that many things they base their lives on may be insecure. We can have a quite shattering effect, and most students have no idea just how powerful and corrosive sceptical beliefs can be. Believing on the evidence is for many people not a simple thing. And I'd like to share with you what one student wrote. She wrote a fairly thoughtful appraisal of the course. Now, this was an extremely intelligent young woman. She was also deeply troubled. She had real problems which prevented her from ever going full out. She got through the course easily enough, but she didn't really go full out. And she wrote, commenting rather ironically on some of the things that I had promised that the course would do. This is what she wrote. She said, "I feel empowered with knowledge. I've learnt the skills that Martin promised. I've been, quote, equipped with a cluster of intellectual skills and abilities. And I now, quote, foster a questioning and investigative approach to most aspects of life. But I also feel like I've lost out in something. I've lost the ability to believe for the sake of believing, a trait which may be scorned in academic circles, but gives a thoroughly liberating and boundless quality to the soul." Now, later on she makes clear that that's an emotional reaction. She makes it quite clear that in an academic approach you can't base a course on evidence which does not exist, and I had to do what I did. But that was her emotional reaction to the course, to the sheer corrosive impact of scepticism and what it can do to people who are not ready for it. And I don't really know what to do about the sheer power of the sceptical approach when people are exposed to it who really aren't quite ready for it. So, in sum, here are some strong and weak points in this course. First of all, it's got intellectual integrity. It's got a clear-cut set of principles which are followed through. Secondly, it's non-prescriptive as regards beliefs. I genuinely don't mind what conclusions students come to, provided they've mastered the intellectual tools. They're young adults. Once they've got the tools, it's up to them what they do with them. And thirdly, they can focus on their own particular interests. Whether it's Chinese medicine or homeopathy or acupuncture or the lost continent of Atlantis, it's up to them. They must be able to apply sceptical tools to it and come to a conclusion. Weak points. It's intellectual rather than practical. I feel very envious of people like Lynn Kelly or Henri Bloch, who wrote an article for the Skeptical Inquirer, who can actually do wonderful things and do wonderful demonstrations. If I do wonderful demonstrations, they never work. I have to keep at the intellectual level. So I'm rather stuck there. Secondly, it's too dependent upon one person. That person is me. Now, the educationists have got a term for people like me. I'm a lone ranger. That is, I do something on my own initiative. It works very well. But then when I retire or move to another institution, it's lost. And the universities are discovering that lone rangers, in fact, can lose them quite a lot because they do something, then they move on, and it's all gone. And I don't know everything. I've been educated this course myself. Students have produced all kinds of weirdness that I didn't know existed. Roswell rods, the Mozart effect, cattle mutilation. I mean, the amount of weirdness out there is quite incredible. I don't know much about any of it. And finally, it's isolated. As far as I know, there is one other person at Griffith University, and he's on another campus, who has some interest in sceptical matters, and that's all. This course stands completely by itself. When I retire, I suspect the course is going to disappear, because I don't think there's anybody to carry it on. On the other hand, I do have a fair number of years to go before retirement, and I tend to have a great deal of fun doing the course for those particular years. Okay, that's your lot.
Brief rendition of the William Hill Overture, and then you can ask the Lone Ranger some questions.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I have been attempting to teach the adults at Year 3A skepticism, and you have a far better technique of doing it. Are you able to make available, for example, just some of the things on those slides there, the little thing with skepticism and the little things like that? Or is it all secret?
No, it's not secret. Fred, write to me and I'll give you everything I've got. It's not a problem at all. Yeah, absolutely. I'll give you more stuff than you want, probably.
Just a question about assessment. It's a very hard thing to assess whether students actually understand critical thinking. You've got 50 students. I've got 1,500 first-year psychology students. We do a week on the Barnum effect and a week on experimental design and all that. But then, given the cost of assessing so many students, the best we can do is multiple choice questions at the end.
Yeah.
How do you assess critical thinking in a large group? Is it possible?
Only if you've got a large group of people to assess them. Now, we've got our first year of 320, and I have half a dozen tutors who work with me and assess their work. 50 is manageable. I could probably do it myself up to about 80 or 100, and then I'll have to start to think about other methods. But yes, of course, the managers and the computer people are constantly pushing you towards multiple choice, and multiple choice is very limited. I don't have an answer to that, except that I sit in the seminars, I listen to them, and I mark them, and I give them feedback. I don't have a simple answer.
I could perhaps answer that question. I used to give the students a question and say, write me some multiple choice answers to this question. And it wasn't the sort of thing they could look up on the net, but it did very well illustrate whether they were critical thinkers, because you could tell from their answers, A, whether they knew what the question meant, B, whether they paid any attention about the course, and C, how smart they were at writing almost right answers, which were wrong.
I shall make use of that. I take it it's not patented or copyrighted.
No, but it works well.
You mentioned evidence-based medicine. Can you give us any reference or website where you get
To
more
what, sorry?
information about that? Evidence-based medicine.
Yeah, just type in the Cochrane collaboration into your Google. C-O-C-H-R-A-N-E, the Cochrane collaboration. Or go to your university library and just type in evidence-based medicine. My university doesn't yet have a medical school, but it's got several books on evidence-based medicine. And Cochrane collaboration is British, evidence-based medicine. There's several organisations in the USA which use it. And once you get onto the website, you get a book or two on it. It's really quite easy to use. And what's more, it does apply to the paranormal. They use evidence-based medicine on normal medicine, and they also use it on paranormal medicine. If you do some digging, you'll find it.
When somebody tells you to type the Cochrane collaboration into your Google, you start to feel a bit uncomfortable. One question? No, everybody knows everything right. No more questions. So, going once. Thank you.